Hello friends, welcome to CEC Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in this session we are going to continue further in our series on women in history. Friends, in past we have conducted numerous sessions under this series, and today also we will try to give you in-depth knowledge on the topic, because under the series we are going to talk on harem and women. And for the discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios Dr. Shruti Pip. Dr. Shruti Pip is Assistant Professor in Department of History, PGDA Evening College, University of Delhi. Friends, while listening to the lecture, we know that you will be having lots of questions in mind, but today you can write to us at info.cec@nic.in after watching the entire lecture, as well as after watching the lecture on YouTube, which will be uploaded soon. And afterwards, you can write to us at the same ID and ask questions. We'll try to give you answers to your questions when next time Dr. Shruti Pip visits our studio. But for now, we would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Pip, once again, and would request her to give us in-depth knowledge on today's topic. Hello, ma. Welcome to the lecture.
Hello, Geetika. Thanks a lot for this wonderful opportunity. I really feel privileged to be on this platform. Today, we shall be talking about women in medieval Indian history. So we have done in-depth study on women's position during the ancient Indian historical period. So today our topic of discussion would be largely speaking harem, with reference to the position of women during the medieval Indian period of Indian history. As far as the outline of the lecture goes, in today's lecture, we shall explore whether the harem or the zenana was a hallmark of patriarchal values, and also did it work only on coercion, that is force, or did the consent or help of women helped men to secure their own power and position. So, while we are going to discuss all this, we would also explore as to how women secured their own positions for their future by performing certain functions in harem, and also by taking certain political positions in the in this entire set of zenana. The term harem, which can also be equated with another term antahpura, which basically referred to the indigenous before the Muslim started influencing the kind of socio-political landscape of India. So even before that, there was an institution called Antahpura, which corresponded to or which basically indicated the inner, the inner portion of the mahal, in which it was the royal ladies along with their retinue of servants and maid servants who resided there. So the term harem basically refers to the parts of a house to which access was forbidden, and hence more particularly it referred to women's quarters, and the same kind of reference can also be found for Antahpura, which basically meant the women's quarters within the palace. It was not due to the Muslim invasions that women were made to remain inside quarters, or that seclusion was just to imitate the Muslim lifestyle. The idea that was widely prevalent for a long time, because so much research has been undertaken on this aspect of harem and the role of women's agency during the medieval period, and most of the research has explored as to how women, even in the Muslim aristocratic families, they played a very important and a very active, though somewhat different kind of role, and in no way their agency could be overlooked. And similar instances have also been pointed out for harem, where though they were living with the women folk and they were all surrounded by women or knots, but still they were directly or indirectly associated with what was happening in the larger realm. So coming back to our discussion on Antahpura, in the past it was known as, the harem was known as Antahpura, and it was a Sanskrit word which means the inner apartments, suggesting their position in the palace as secure, sheltered, and basically barred from the common gaze. That is, no ordinary men folk could really put their gaze on this part of the palace, and no male members were allowed to go to Antahpura without pre-informing the ladies through a retinue of maid servants. So this kind of seclusion was maintained even prior to the institution of harem that was established from Sultanate period onwards. So another important discussion that needs to be undertaken in course of our discussion is that harem was not only a social institution where only women resided, rather it was a very important center of political activity also. And the harem in fact conceived women as constituting a center of polity. It was considered as a very powerful institution from where the other institutions took their instructions from, that is, the king as a patriarch was invulnerable. So this very idea also was generated within the four walls of harem and with the kind of socio-cultural system that was prevalent in harem. Now, before we continue further, it is important to highlight some perceptions which have been part of the general discourse on medieval Indian history, specifically with regard to women. The older belief was that the harem or the zenanas had a major disadvantage in terms of participation in the outside world, and that the women inside were generally passive, they were meek, they were generally hidden behind the veil. So they were kind of, not as free and not as participative as the earlier women belonging to royalty were. So this was basically the kind of discourse that had been that various traditional historians had kind of carried forward from generations to generations. Another misconception was that the women in the harem had limited access to resources, whether it was economic resources, it was trade, it was mobilization of resources, or other economic activities that were going on in the empire. And another misconception was that their seclusion kind of induced them to concentrate mainly on their physical beauty and also performing their reproductive tasks. So this was the kind of discourse which projected a very limited role that was played by women in harem, which was basically revolving around the kind of fun, enjoyment, recreational activities which an emperor would be indulging, and for entertaining himself he would be going to harem for a while and get that kind of entertainment, and the ladies of the harem were only supposed to perform that kind of function, that kind of limited function, and it was believed that the women's life in harem centered basically around their sex appeal, around their beauty, around their jewelry, around the kind of lavish lifestyle that Mughals championed. So this was the kind of picture that had been painted for so long as far as the Mughal harem was concerned. And for this we have examples of scholars like K.S. Lal, who described harem as a place of beautiful female forms which kind of originated in the polygamous nature of Mughal men, and as and also as a household unit. It was an institution which was basically based on male polygamy. So basically, because the male members of aristocracy had a number of wives, so they had to be housed somewhere, and harem was the place, and it was related to the contemporary notions of sexual propriety, that is, what was proper and what was improper for the male and the female members of Mughal society. With this kind of a limited vision that was accorded to, and the limited role models that were kind of considered as being specific to women who were part of harem, however, has been challenged by a number of scholars and the recent research. So for example, Leslie Pierce has discussed in detail the role of women in Ottoman Empire, and Pierce points out that it should be reassessed, the role of women in harem should be reassessed because it involved a complex set of relationships that did not necessarily include a sex role only. So therefore, one has to get over this fact and consider the wider implications that were playing a very important role, and the multitude of relationships that were existing and the complex web of political ideologies that were emerging and that were not only affecting the male royalty but also the female royalty. Therefore, Pierce points out that it was not a confined space which was inhabited exclusively by the wives and the concubines of the emperors or the royalty. It was much more than that. There was much more substance to harem, and it was much more than merely a place where the emperor could enjoy his private life. The new kind of research has also pointed out to the fact that how a diverse community of women of varying ages, they interacted with each other in different ways and at also different levels. So it was not as if the women were nobody, or they had no kind of independent judgments or no independent relationships. The mutual relationships that they shared with other women as well as which they shared with the male members of royalty were very important and crucial, and many times they had political implications as well. There were many dependents as well as slaves and servants who performed specific tasks, and therefore they performed kind of various skilled occupations and functions. So therefore, harem again cannot be dismissed only as a place of sexual orgies or pleasure. Rather, it was playing a very important productive role in Mughal economy, because it was also kind of patronizing skilled craftsmen, and the whole production process was definitely geared to the ladies who were housed in harem. So therefore, what one comes across in this whole discourse or narrative regarding harem and Mughal women is the problematic of reality versus rhetoric. So what was the reality and how it was different from what was being projected, what had been projected by the contemporary sources or even by the by the historians. So the Zenana comprised of women of all relations who were not simply an object of sexual pleasure as had widely been perceived. So this was the rhetoric, that Zenana was a place of sexual entertainment of the Mughal aristocracy. But the reality was that it had a social world of its own. So it could not really be explained only in such limited terms as had been done till now. It had a social world of its own where women performed different kinds of work based on hierarchical division of labor. Now this hierarchical division of labor was important on one level, but then there was hierarchy on another level also. also, and this was the hierarchy of relationships, the hierarchy of, you know, the kind of tie-ups that these women had, and the kind of influential influences that these women had. There was a hierarchy associated to that also, and Indrani Chatterjee has basically discussed the hierarchical structure of Mughal harem, and how all women who were living in harem could not be equated, and they did not definitely belong to one status only. It was this very hierarchical structure of Zenana that induced women to be ambitious, that motivated women to come to be noticed by the important male members of Mughal aristocracy, and to remain in limelight. So therefore, there was a kind of struggle always, even within Zenana, to get maximum benefit out of this relationship. And the study of harem is basically not a study of the sexual lives of the emperors. Rather, it is the study of exploration of power that was articulated through hierarchies of age, wealth, social status, and of course sexuality. So therefore, there needs to be a much wider discourse with a much more logical narrative, rather than a unilateral focus on a particular aspect of a lavish lifestyle, or the kind of immorality that had crept in, which gave harem its important features. So therefore, a very important statement that had been made by Indrani was that Zenanas can be described as intensely political arenas. So therefore, a Zenana could not be dismissed as a non-serious kind of a subject, which was only concerned about fashion, which was only concerned about costumes or jewelry. Rather, very important political battles were planned here, schemed here, and it was an arena in its own way. So it was not only warfare, which was a very important part of Mughal power, because these schemes and counter schemes also played a very important and a very active role at times in promoting one particular member of aristocracy to the throne, because there was no policy of primogeniture. That is, just like in the most of the Hindu dynasties, it was the eldest male member, the eldest son, who would be become the emperor after the king's death. But this was not the case with the Mughal aristocracy. So therefore, battles were fought in name of throne and in name of acquiring power and position, and it was the harem which played a very important role, silently or vocally, in promoting the cause of a particular contender. Then another very important fact that can be added to this discussion is the polygamous nature of the Mughal household, which helped again women to carve a niche for themselves, to carve a special sphere of influence for themselves, because they were always competing with the rival wives to gain attention of the monarch or the members of the royalty who were important in their lives. So therefore, they had to be smart enough, they had to be calculative enough, and they had to be active enough. They had to exercise their agency so that they could find a place for themselves under the sun. So they could just not be the doormats of the male members of aristocracy. They had to be very careful, they had to be scheming. And there could be two ways of participation in the politics of the day. One was interference from behind the curtain, or Another was active participation. Now, of course, due to patriarchal system that was prevalent, a very active participation was not called for, and except for a few women, some examples like Noor Jahan, or for that matter for some time Mumtaz Mahal or Razia Sultan, there were very few women who actively participated in the politics of the time. Rather, their participation was more indirect in nature and also behind the curtain. But nevertheless, it was important, it was crucial, and it was most of the times result oriented. As I just mentioned, that there was a hierarchy that was embedded in harem, in the relationships that emerged in harem, so the rank in harem needs to be understood with more careful discussion as to which category of women were the strongest or the most powerful. It was not the age that was important or the seniority it was not the age that made a woman senior to another woman, but a woman's rank as a grandmother, a mother, a wife, or sister, that was important. So therefore, what relationship a woman had with the emperor, that was the crucial deciding factor in deciding which rank that lady acquired in the harem and the kind of role play that she was going to enter into. In this regard, E.B. Findlay has remarked that it was the seniority system that was the harem's most powerful guarantor of status. So, the more senior a woman was pertaining to her relationship with the emperor, the higher her rank would be, and this would also be the deciding factor behind internal cohesion and generational compatibility. So, the kind of women who got along well with each other definitely belonged to a particular generation. Now, despite the courtesy of seniority system in Zenana, there were mutual jealousies which could not be done away with, and many times these mutual jealousies, they also transcended the boundaries of rank, and the jealousy could be between the wife of the emperor and also the mother of the emperor. So as to have their own coterie, enjoying maximum powers and prestige. The apartments that were reserved for the use of emperor's women, as I just discussed with you, were called mahals, and harem was a place which was self-sufficient with a full range of staff and administrators. So again, harem was an institution in itself. It was a very important part of Mughal aristocratic prestige and lifestyle, and it was both a composite and a cosmopolitan institution that not only provided employment to women of various religions, provinces, nationalities, but it was also the public lives of the women of nobility which were governed by the laws of seclusion. So, it was less of a social or a religious kind of a place, and it was more of a class arrangement that became very important as the organizing principle of harem. It was not as if harem was an institution that was introduced by the Mughals, and before that women were free to live anywhere and royal women had no specific areas that were earmarked for them. Even prior to the Mughals, there was a concept of Zenana Diary. Zenana Diary was a term that was used for the area that was specifically earmarked for women, for royal women, and the term was widely prevalent in Rajasthan. And this basically consisted of women like Rajmata, Patrani, and then the concubines and other female relatives or the female attendants. Varsha Joshi has conducted a detailed study on Zenana Diary that was prevalent as an institution in Rajasthan, and she has given a list of female attendants that were there, which basically conforms to some kind of a replication of caste system within the female quarters, because different kind of jobs were ascribed to women or professionals who belonged to different social categories. Then Indrani Chatterjee has also termed this as a slave-based harem system within the ideological and ritual confines of Hindu Rajput polities. So therefore, the same kind of gradation and status variation that we just talked about the Mughal Zenana or Mughal harem was also to be seen in these Rajput kingdoms, where the whole production process was something like a slave based harem system within the larger ritual narrative of the Rajput polities, and each Rani had her own establishment in her Zenana, and this was also known by the name of Rani as Rathorni Rani ji ki sarkar or Jhalia ji ki sarkar. So by sarkar it basically meant the retinue of officers or the personal attendants that each Rani maintained, and therefore the identity also came from the name of the Rani. And the most important woman here was the Queen Mother, who held a very high dignity and commanded lot of respect and also influential position, just like Mughal Zenana. She played a very important role in the transmission of political values and also furthered the interest of her own son. So therefore, more or less, the working capacity of women or the political influences that women in Zenana Diary they kind of enjoyed remained more or less the same, and there are some very interesting references also that have been given by some contemporary travelers who kind of visited India, and they noticed the working and functioning of harem. But since the time is telling me to stop here, so I would be discussing the account of foreign travelers and how they have explained whatever they observed, and they were kind of amused also by the whole functioning of the institution of harem. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much for giving us this session. Friends, you are requested to be with us, as we are going to be back after a short break and would be discussing more. Till then, be with us. Thank you. Hello friends, welcome back to this session. Friends, as you know that today we are talking on harem and women. This is the topic. In the previous session we discussed a lot, and as promised, here we are again for you. Friends, for the discussion, we have with us in our studios Dr. Shruti Pip. Dr. Shruti Pip is Assistant Professor in Department of History, PGDAV, Evening College, University of Delhi. So dear friends, let's begin from the point where we left in the previous session, and let's try to discuss more. Now, I would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Shruti Pip, once again. Hello, ma'am. Welcome to the lecture.
Hello, Vidhi. Thanks a lot. So, continuing our discussion on medieval harem, we were discussing what were the nitty-gritties that were involved, and also how there is a need to reassess and revise our understanding of harem. So, with this revisionist perspective, we are kind of questioning the older narrative which has projected harem as basically a place of entertainment for the royalty and a place where women were only sexually exploited. The revisionist account of various historians has pointed out as to harem was much more than that. It was an institution which was vibrant, which was challenging, and which was politically, socially, culturally, and even economically quite active. Not only active in the production process, but also deciding as to what direction the politics of the day would be taking. Continuing our discussion further, I was telling you about the account of some foreign travelers like Manuki, who has pointed out that how all women had separate apartments in the harem, not only for themselves but also for their slaves and attendants. And talking of Mughal harem, Manuki says that ordinarily there were within the mahal 2000 women of different races. So, this is his first hand account, the way he had observed things, and he further said that each had her own office or a special a place which was either in attendance on king, his wives, or his concubines. It had been a custom that female guards who were bearing bows guarded the king in his inside quarters. So, women were playing a very important role of guarding the king in their personal capacity, and this function also was considered more worthy for the female attendants rather than the male attendants, though in this they were also helped by the knots. There are a number of visuals also which attest to this fact that how the females in medieval India they were playing very active and important roles, and they were also playing the role of being the personal guards of the emperor. There are a number of paintings, which show this kind of a depiction, and a number of miniature paintings. So, a painting belonging to Babur, it shows that how there was a Babur being surrounded by female bodyguards called Urdu Begis, and they mostly came from parts of Central Asia and Kashmir. Then another visual reference in the form of a painting shows Muhammad Shah of Bengal in 1745 being carried by the female servants on the moving throne, which was known as Takhte-Ravan. So, therefore, the very fact that the women were considered as worthy and dependable speaks volume of their important role that they were playing, not only as sex slaves but also in other aspects of Mughal royalty. Then another very important discussion that needs to be undertaken here, especially when we are talking about harem, is the role played by the Naughts. The Naughts could move around freely in the harem. They played a very important role of guarding the king, the queen, and other female members of the royalty in the harem, and they were very often raised to high positions such as Malik Kafur and Malik Amber, and there are a number of other examples which show that how by dutifully performing their functions, they were not only guarding the harem, but they were also kind of proving their loyalty to the royalty. Then another important account came from Thomas Roe, and Thomas Roe has accounted for how the Notch and the women, they guarded the king with huge weapons, and these manly weapons were also carried on were also carried by the women. So they were specifically trained, and they were taught in the art of warfare, and each woman of rank had 2 or more notch heads. One was called Nazir, who was appointed for each wife to ensure that she was not seen by any other man, and she always remained protected, and it was only her husband who could see her. So these knots were also appointed in order to keep a watchful eye on women of harem, which again proves that women were always they wanted to have a feel of the outside world or interact with the strangers, but somehow this was not really encouraged, and the whole politics of seclusion continued. Then these knots also played a very important role as they arranged the contacts of these ladies of Zenana with the outsiders on various matters of economic importance, like trade, military maneuvers, then also courtly intrigues, as well as secret communications. And there are a number of examples to show that how Mumtaz Mahal had invested in overseas trade, the long distance trade, and she also owned fleets of ships. Similarly, Noor Jahan was very active, and she had great sense of great commercial sense, and she also invested in various overseas ventures, and she was also not only a patron of art and fashion and fashionable jewelry and attire, but also she championed the cause of overseas trade. So it was through these notches that the ladies of Zenana, they kind of managed a delicate relationship between the emperor and also his women. As his sexual life was non-existent, a notch had supposedly presumably no sexual life, so therefore he could be trusted, he could be entrusted with the ladies of Zenana, because the rulers thought that these notch, a notch would never commit any kind of sexual impropriety, because they would not have that kind of urge. So therefore they were highly regarded, and they were kind of considered as very dependable. Then another very important feature of harem was the polygamous nature. Polygamy was the important undercurrent of society of those times, and individual women had to make herself visible between the complex lives of others immediately around her. So each individual woman was always at great risk of losing importance to the rival wives, because polygamy was the order of the day. So a woman's life was unstable and miserable in the presence of the co-wives, and therefore scheming had to be there, and politicking had to be undertaken in order to always guard one's own self-interest. So therefore the whole concept of women's agency needs to be explored from this standpoint as well. Then coming to the issue of politics of Zenana, as to how directly or indirectly politics was folding and unfolding in the precincts of Zenana. The king's favorite wife could prove to be dangerous and also ambitious, and there are a number of examples to prove that even before the Mughal dynasty. For example, Shah Turkan was quite ambitious since the time of Iltutmish, and she influenced over various matters pertaining to state, and the Sultan had to continuously keep facing the challenges that were posed by the ladies of the harem like Shah Turkan. Then similarly, another example is that of Malikai Jahan, who was wife of Jalaluddin Khilji, who again was a scheming mother and had a great and she created a lot of problems for Alauddin Khilji, and in order to become politically stable, it had Alauddin Khilji had to face a number of challenges, and she was one such woman who posed a number of hurdles in the accession to the throne for Alauddin Khilji. Then Makhdamai Jahan was another such example, and Khuda Vandzada, mother and sister of Muhammad bin Tughlaq respectively. They were quite powerful women, and they were also calling the shots for a long time. And it was not as if this tendency was prevalent only in the among the Muslim dynasties. Rather, there are a number of examples from Rajput households also. For example, Rani Karnavati, who was wife of Rana Sanga, had considerable influence over her husband, and of course Noor Jahan was quite articulate in her designs and moves, and she could prevail upon Jahangir in a number of ways. So the king, as a patriarch, could not be invulnerable to the women of Zenana. Rather, his exercise of power was accompanied by constant watchfulness, and there was a constant challenge to his power also that was coming from sometimes by his favorite wives also. The king, who was ought to be in control of his household, however, was subject to these various challenges from within the Zenana. Thus, the non-patriarchal values of Zenana could challenge the patriarchy many times, and this was some kind of a contradiction, that while Zenana was the personal fiefdom of the emperor, where all his women were housed and they were supposed to entertain him and they were supposed to entice him and keep him satisfied and entertain, but something else was happening in Zenana, and very often the royalty had to face challenges, and the most important examples are there for us to be seen, and there were a number of revolts also that were organized or planned, in which the women were playing a very important role. Now, while we are discussing all this, it is also important to discuss that how the Mughal women were playing another very constructive role, and that was the role of intermediaries. That is, many times the royal women, especially the senior ladies of Zenana, they would kind of play a role of solving the disputes among the family members. And as a lady, one could not exercise unlimited power and thus had to take, however, the help of her own family members sometimes. So, for example, when a woman in the Zenana wanted to interfere in the politics, of course, she could not do that directly due to the larger patriarchal structure and system that was prevalent. So, very often she took help of her own brothers or her own sons or the faithful nobility, and they directly something which they could not have accomplished directly, they did that indirectly. And here also we can give example of Shah Turkan, who was greatly helped by Junaidi, and also we can give examples of Noor Jahan, who was greatly helped by Shahryar, who was against Khurram, who later on became Emperor Shah Jahan. So, it was the political ambitions of women like Razia who forced them, these political ambitions forced these women to enter into alliances and counter alliances in order to achieve their own targets. And so, we have also example of a lady as early as the Sultanate period in Razia, who depended on a number of male loyalists, and she was even able to gather a faithful army based on such loyalists. So, therefore, women as such, they could not work independently many times, but through the agency of men, they definitely planned a number of such events. And as the society was largely patriarchal, therefore, women did not have direct access to power, and thus had to make their way either by being favorite consort, just like Noor Jahan, or through her sons. With this regard, some very interesting examples have been given by Rekha Mishra, who has described as to how Akbar, when he wanted to establish a strong, centralized, despotic Mughal empire, took advantage of Maham Anga's position in the empire. Maham Anga, who was the foster mother of Akbar, and it was a tradition in those times to greatly respect and value the foster mother. And Maham Anga was not only very diplomatic, but she also had great talents, and this was cleverly utilized by Akbar at a time when he was fighting a number of battles on the home front, when he was busy snubbing his rivals and who were always scheming against him. So, this was a time when this lady helped Akbar a lot, and she was kind of a solid wall, and she was with her own coterie, she kind of provided endless support to Akbar. But at the same time, Akbar never allowed himself to be dominated by the ladies of the harem, and very soon Akbar did away with the overarching influence that Maham Anga had started wielding on him. So, therefore, the male members were always on their guard, and while they made full use of the charms or the of the abilities of the royal women, they were clever enough to watch their own interests, and when the talents of the women were no longer needed, because Akbar by that time had considerably enhanced his position, had secured his position. So, therefore, there was a complete roundabout that was undertaken, and the patriarchy finally triumphed. However, having said so, I would like to talk about another very important role that Mughal women were playing, especially the senior ladies of the Mughal household, and that was the role of the mediator. So, women in harem played a very crucial role in various matters of disputes of succession, and all the functions, all the factions, all the different political groups in the empire sought their support from time to time. So, therefore, it was not as if the harem was a secluded or it was a dormant institution. And in fact, a very important title was that of Walide Sultan. Walide Sultan was basically the mother of the emperor, and she played a vital role in not only in transmission of political values among the royal children, but also the protection and preservation of the dynasty. This was one of her most important function. And so, here we can say that Walide Sultan, though she was a woman, but she was much more than a woman. She was, it was her job to train the royal children in the art of royalty, to provide them with the right kind of tutelage, lessons of morality, and the kind of dignity dignity and dignified life they had to lead in future. And she could also then decide as to whom she was going to favor during the war of succession. So therefore, there were a number of fratricidal strifes that were rampant, and this was basically leading to war of succession, frequent wars of succession, and the frequent occurrence in settling the issue of royal succession gave lot of opportunity to the royal ladies in Zenana to call it a day. And the role of senior ladies was that of a peacemaker most of the times, when they would be kind of try to intervene and also let some sense prevail. And since the succession disputes were very important political battles also, they played a very important role, and they formed different cliques and also adjustments so as to further the interests of their own candidates. There are a number of examples to prove this also, and in fact in a very important memoir of Gulbadan Begum, Humayunama, she has confided as to how the senior ladies of the household would play a very important role, and this important role was all the more clearly visible during the time of Babur and Humayun, because this was the time when the Mughal Empire was still in a very fluid situation. It had not really been firmly established as an empire per se, especially at the time of Babur, so therefore, these ladies had far important roles to play during these two important rulers of the Mughal dynasty, and they were always on the move, and they were also moving along with in a number of caravans. They were moving along with the emperors, along with Babur and Humayun. They were living in temporary camps, and so therefore their kind of association with the royalty was on a more equal basis, and their influence also was of a different category. Whereas by the time of Akbar, Mughal Empire, most of the institutions of Mughal Empire had firmly been established, and the help of such ladies was no longer so much sought for, and Akbar in any case was on a drive. He was already treading the road towards a centralized despotic state structure, and he never wanted to share his power with women of Zenana. So there was lot of restriction that was imposed and lot of ritualization that emerged at the time of Akbar, who kind of more firmly implemented the institution of parda, and also the whole process of seclusion was all the more implemented, and the whole process of following etiquettes and a very proper kind of code of conduct that was implemented in order to proclaim his own superior status. So as a result, the kind of powerful and strong influence which Zenana was able to enjoy during the first two Mughal emperors was clearly mellowing down by the time of Akbar, but this does not mean that Zenana had completely changed into a dormant institution. The contemporary perception for women participating in such type of disputes, however, is quite derogatory, and most of the royal chroniclers like Abul Fazl Badani, they have kind of conveyed this kind of a mindset, and it largely reflected the patriarchal society's inhibitions. It reflected a fear, and also it reflected an indirect affirmation of the significance of women in the contemporary political scene. So it basically proves and it speaks volumes on how women were definitely playing important role, and they were quite conducive to playing active role, but this was something that was not really being liked by the contemporary account keepers or by the larger nobility. And so therefore, this kind of a discourse was unfolding time and again, and there was a lot of emphasis on not letting women play this kind of an active role, and something which we observe from the time of Akbar onwards, when some very important Mughal institutions had matured, and they all were geared towards the establishment of a centralized despotic state structure. Now, having discussed all this, I would like to point out that in the next lecture, we would be specifically talking about some very important women of Zenana who were members of Mughal royalty, and the kind of important roles that they played and how they created a benchmark for women of future generations, and also they keep on inspiring the current generation of women as well. Thank you.
So thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much for giving us some in-depth knowledge on today's topic. Dear friends, we know that you might have questions in mind and you would like to give your feedback for this lecture. If yes, then do write to us at info.cec@nic.in. Friends, we are going to upload this lecture on YouTube very soon, and after watching the lectures, definitely you can write to us. All the lectures pertaining to the series Women in History are there for you on YouTube, and from the previous lectures also, if you have any query, you can share with us, and we will try to give answers to your questions when next time Dr. Shruti Webb visits our studio. So friends, we are taking your leave with the promise that we are going to meet in our forthcoming sessions, and our next session is tomorrow only. So keep watching us, keep writing us. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you once again.
Thanks a lot.